Okay, so in a leaked U.S. government diplomatic cable provided by WikiLeaks, thank you Julian Assange, the current director of the CIA and former ambassador to Moscow, William Burns, wrote that Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which would seriously affect Russian security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or, at worst, civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision that Russia does not want to have to face. You're a Putin apologist. This is literally the head of the CIA. You're calling him a Putin simp? Well, no. Or what about the chief architect of United States Cold War policy during the 20th century, George Kennan, who was instrumental in opposing Russia and the Soviet Union? George Kennan gave an interview to the New York Times in 1998, directly following the Senate voting on expanding NATO to the east, which would include the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. And even he is quoted as saying, "I think NATO expansion is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves." You're a Russian propagandist. Are you saying that George Kennan is a Russian propagandist? Well, no. He continues, "Don't people understand? Our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime, and now we are turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime. And Russia's democracy is as far advanced, if not farther, as any of these countries we've just signed up to defend from Russia." Of course, there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia. And then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that is how the Russians are. But this is just wrong. So is George Kennan a Putin apologist here? Mind you, this was just the reaction after the first round of NATO expansion, which did not include Ukraine yet, which would have been far worse, of course, because that is along Russia's borders. These countries were not necessarily along the borders. And this was already the interpretation of one of the chief architects of policy planning in the United States government during the 20th century. George Kennan is literally the first director of policy planning post-World War II. Or what about the promises we made to Russia concerning NATO that it would not move 1 inch eastward, which we quickly thwarted? 30 years ago, the current conflict with Russia was foretold and feared. George Kennan, James Baker, who was the former Secretary of State, Senator Edward Kennedy, Senator Sam Nunn, Thomas Friedman, and others all warned in the 90s of a new Cold War if NATO was expanded without including Russia. If I am a Russian apologist for merely citing the fact that NATO expansion led to the war in Ukraine, then so is the current head of the CIA and former ambassador to Russia, William Burns, who admitted that NATO expansion will lead to war back in 2009. If I am a Russian apologist, then so is the former Secretary of State, James Baker. So is Senators Sam Nunn and Edward Kennedy. So is the former Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, who almost resigned after Clinton expanded NATO in 1998 because he was so vehemently against NATO expansion. If I am a Russian apologist, then so is George Kennan, the first director of policy planning at the height of the Cold War, one of the chief architects of the Cold War, who also admitted and condemned NATO expansion back in 1998 and predicted a war in Ukraine. Putin is a psychopath. I don't believe Putin is a psychopath. Well, you're a Putin shill, a Kremlin propagandist, a Russian apologist. Understanding that NATO provoked and escalated a geopolitical situation which ultimately led to war in Ukraine, being used as a proxy between the United States and Russia, is not a justification for what is an illegal invasion and a war crime committed by the Russian government against Ukraine. Both of these things can be true. No, you're just defending Russia. You're apologizing for Putin when you say that NATO escalation led to war. war. Brother, even the head of NATO himself, Jens Stoltenberg, admitted publicly that NATO escalation led to the war in Ukraine, as have an innumerable amount of US officials over the past 3 decades. You're justifying the Russian invasion. Being anti-NATO isn't being pro-Russia. Escalating a physical conflict between two nuclear world powers spells disaster for the entire world. The point is, the invasion is a war crime and should be rightly condemned, and yet also there were reasons which were predicted leading to the war itself. Those are two objective facts about the crisis in Ukraine. It's always hilarious to me when 15-year-olds come into my comment section acting like they understand geopolitics, or at the bare minimum, understand the concept of a proxy war. This person obviously doesn't understand that the US is using the Ukraine as cannon fodder currently, and the Ukraine, whether he knows it or not, is going to be decimated because of the actions of the US government in prolonging and further escalating this war. It's just funny that this person thinks that they are morally posturing as the good guy because they're standing up for Ukraine. This is what I mean by people that have bought the imperial narrative hook, line, and sinker. They have a binary way of thinking. It's Russia bad, America good. Notice that in this person's mind, real socialists side with US capitalist imperialism. I mean, I totally get the confusion and have empathy for it. You know, I was a teenager once as well. Just acknowledging the power differential in world affairs is enough for someone to just throw a temper tantrum over this. It's really silly. It's really silly. This is what I mean when US propaganda has worked wholeheartedly, completely on a person. You cannot even question, why is the US meddling in Eastern Europe? Why is the US controlling the South Pacific? Why is the US controlling Latin America? These are above reproach. These are axioms about the world. We need not question them. The US is supposed to be meddling and intervening in every part of the world. That's just how it is, and we should take that and accept it. And if you question that, then you're obviously a Putin apologist, you're a Putin simp, or whatever other, insult they can think of. If you can think critically through these things and objectively, you can arrive at a better understanding of what is actually happening in the world. It's very strange that some of the most powerful people on the planet, some of the most consequential players in US foreign policy, are admitting that NATO expansion was going to lead to war. And yet, if you bring this up, you are quickly called a Putin apologist just for stating the historical record, which is revealed in declassified documents from the United States government itself. All you have to do is go to the National Security Archive and find it. They're not going to talk about this in corporate media. They're going to call it an unprovoked invasion. They'll never say that this was provoked. They just want you to go to sleep and think that Russia is evil, Russia is tyrannical, Putin has bloodlust, he's hell-bent on conquering the world. Whatever fearful thing that they can incite within you is what they're going to say, because it's a classic good versus evil. That's what is a part of American exceptionalism. We're the good guys, they're the evil guys. We must overcome the evil in the world. We are defenders of freedom and democracy. The United States has literally created a global military intervention force in NATO, which is designed to control the world's pipelines and sea lanes for the US-backed financial economy. It has conducted illegal invasions, offensive invasions in Libya, in Serbia, Bosnia, in Afghanistan, and Iraq, and yet you still have people saying that this is a defensive pact. Just because it says that on the NATO website. The United States has installed military bases along Russia's borders. The United States has installed nuclear warheads in Poland, capable of obliterating Moscow within minutes. It's considered first strike tactical advantage. NATO has trained 100,000 Ukrainian troops in the past decade, essentially baking in the Ukrainian military into the U.S. chain of command. The United States has entered into a hostile military alliance with many of Russia's neighbors, many at the border. How do you think Russia would perceive this? Where is the analog of Russia doing this anywhere in the Western Hemisphere to the United States? Is there any precedent for what the United States is doing in that region of the world? I ask you honestly, if Russia was doing this to the United States with one of our neighbors anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, what do you think the United States would do? The United States would definitely react, but no buts. That's where it ends. If it is wrong for them to do that to us, then it is wrong for us to do that to them. This is elementary, basic morality a 5-year-old can understand. As an American citizen, you have no moral high ground here. Yeah, but Russia's invasion was illegal and wrong. To understand the provocation and escalation to war does not condone the reaction from Russia. The two are not mutually exclusive. What is absolutely hilarious about this tone-deaf comment is that this has already happened in spades, committed by the United States against Mexico and South America and all of Latin America for that matter. We have illegally invaded Mexico and annexed a third of that country's land in the 1840s. Most recently, we've had senators on the Congress floor arguing that we should invade Mexico yet again. We've invaded Panama, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Cuba. Reagan is literally the only U.S. president to be formally indicted by the International Court of Justice for illegally invading Nicaragua in 1985, and he did that under the pretense of stopping the Russians. These were preemptive invasions. How many preemptive wars has the United States started? Let me ask you something, and this should tell you everything. Do you see any Russians or Chinese anywhere in the Western Hemisphere? Anywhere threatening the United States borders? No. Do we see the United States anywhere near Russia or China? Yes. We all get that you don't understand geopolitics, but the people in the highest levels of government, they understand it. The head of the CIA, the head of NATO, the State Department, all of these institutions understand what's going on and they understand what's at stake. And they all knew that pushing NATO, which is a global military intervention force run by the United States, all the way up to Russia's borders was going to lead to war, and they knew that for decades, and they still did it. That is not justification for Russians invading Ukraine. If I were to say that man-made global warming is causing a climate catastrophe, that is not justification for man-made global warming. It was less than 2 months ago where I made a video entitled NATO Expansion Led to War. In the video, I cited numerous government sources which corroborated this claim, including a leaked memo written by the current CIA head, William J. Burns, including direct quotes given by George Kennan, who was the Cold War Director of Policy Planning, in an interview he gave in 1998 to the New York Times. I also cited other U.S. government officials who are on record as verifying that NATO expansion led to war in Ukraine. James Baker, Senator Edward Kennedy, Senator Sam Nunn, Thomas Friedman. In addition to that video, I actually have an entire playlist dedicated to the subject of NATO expansion and the Ukraine war. Of course, I was called a Russian lover, a Putin shill, a Russian propagandist for merely quoting the United States government with their own words. Comment after comment, and yet now, just last week, the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has admitted that NATO expansion was the reason that the Russians invaded Ukraine. In testimony to the European Union Parliament, Stoltenberg made clear that it was America's relentless push to enlarge NATO to Ukraine that was the real cause of the war and why it continues today. Here are Stoltenberg's revealing words. The background was that President Putin declared in the autumn of 21 and actually sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us, and was a precondition to not invade Ukraine. And of course, we didn't sign that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO, close to his borders. He has got the exact opposite. This is the head of NATO admitting the reason Putin and Russia went to war was to stop NATO expansion. I really wonder what crafty denial these hawkish jingoists will invent now that the head of NATO has gone on record disagreeing with them. I'm pretty sure they will grasp at straws, saying things like, Russia shouldn't have interpreted NATO expansion as a sign of aggression, as if that's an argument. Speaking to a New York Times reporter in 1998, shortly after the Senate voted to expand NATO to Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, George Kennan expressed concern and disappointment for the ruling, saying, "It shows so little understanding of Russian history and Soviet history. Of course there's going to be a bad reaction from Russia, and then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that is how the Russians are, but this is just wrong." George Kennan literally predicted these kinds of people. Reacting to the first round of NATO expansion, George Kennan said, "I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves." So if you're going to call me a Russian apologist, don't stop there. Call the director of Cold War policy planning a Russian apologist. Call all the US officials I cited here in this video Russian apologists. These are their words. Citing reasons for the illegal invasion by Russia into Ukraine is not a justification for the war. This is what I mean when I say people lack critical thinking. They cannot stomach a narrative that is counter to the Western imperial one that they've been fed by corporate news media outlets, by the CIA, by the State Department itself. They immediately clutch their pearls and start name-calling. What is absolutely hilarious about this tone-deaf comment is that this has already happened in spades, committed by the United States against Mexico and South America and all of Latin America for that matter. We have illegally invaded Mexico and annexed a third of that country's land in the 1840s. Most recently, we've had senators on the Congress floor arguing that we should invade Mexico yet again. We've invaded Panama, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Cuba. Reagan is literally the only US president to be formally indicted by the International Court of Justice for illegally invading Nicaragua in 1985, and he did that under the pretense of stopping the Russians. These were preemptive invasions. How many preemptive wars has the United States started? Let me ask you something, and this should tell you everything. Do you see any Russians or Chinese anywhere in the Western Hemisphere? Anywhere threatening the United States borders? No. Do we see the United States anywhere near Russia or China? Yes. We all get that you don't understand geopolitics, but the people in the highest levels of government, they understand it. The head of the CIA, the head of NATO, the State Department, all of these institutions understand what's going on and they understand what's at stake. And they all knew that pushing NATO, which is a global military intervention force run by the United States, all the way up to Russia's borders was going to lead to war, and they knew that for decades, and they still did it. That is not justification for Russians invading Ukraine. If I were to say that man-made global warming is causing a climate catastrophe, that is not justification for man-made global warming. Putin is a psychopathic dictator, and he is hell-bent on taking over Ukraine and colonizing it and subsuming it into Mother Russia. If that's the case, then why didn't Russia do what the US does when it wants to take over a country like it did with Iraq? Bomb the capital immediately, bomb the presidential palace, destroy basic infrastructure, do all of the things necessary to take out a government and take over a country. Instead, Russia sends in a small force of 40,000 troops going up against the second largest army in all of Europe in Ukraine. The math ain't mathin'. If Russia's goal was to colonize Ukraine, then why didn't it send in a sufficient force strong enough to do so? Answer: because Russia's goal was not to colonize Ukraine. It was to coerce Ukraine to come to the negotiating table and agree to what they formally agreed to was the Minsk Agreement in 2015, which they reneged on. No way, bro. Putin said himself that he longs for the USSR. He's trying to put the old band back together. Western liberals always reference the first half of that quote, but never the second. The full quote that Putin said was, "If you do not miss the Soviet Union, then you have no heart. If you want the Soviet Union back together, you have no brain." He is not looking to put the Soviet Union back together, and he has never stated so. He is expressing nostalgia for the Soviet Union, as have the majority of citizens in the Eastern Bloc, including Ukraine. No one is defending Russia. What honest, sane, critical thinking people are doing is acknowledging the extreme power imbalance in world affairs. Given that you have one global superpower which literally controls the entire world. Of course we are more critical of the United States. The United States deserves it. America is the only global superpower. It is largely responsible for the state of the world. The United States has the lion's share of war crimes. It has the lion's share of human rights abuses. Given that we have in NATO a global military intervention force run by the US, which controls the world's energy supply, it controls the world's pipelines and the sea lanes, and props up militarily the US-dominated financial system. NATO is an alliance born out of the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, NATO should have been disbanded. Much like the Warsaw Pact, which was the Russian counterpart to NATO, much like the Warsaw Pact disbanded, much like the Soviet Union disbanded. It was no longer a threat. So why do we still have NATO? In fact, NATO promised not to move 1 inch eastward. That was the direct quote made by Secretary of State James Baker under President George H.W. Bush. And yet, since 1991, after the Berlin Wall fell, it has moved closer and closer to Russia's borders. And Russia has always thought of NATO as an existential threat. It has repeated its security concerns over the years. Their security concerns have never changed. If you look at the history, you look at statements, you look at foreign policy directives made by the Kremlin, they've always expressed that Ukraine was a red line. This is why we have the documentation to prove it. This is why we have senior statesmen, high-ranking US officials admitting that if NATO kept on its trajectory, on its course, that it would inevitably lead to a war with Russia. And indeed it has. That's why you have Secretary of State James Baker admitting this. That's why you have William Burns, the current head of the CIA, who was the ambassador to Russia, in a leaked document admitting the same thing. That's why you have one of the worst war criminals in the 20th century, Henry Kissinger, most unpopularly calling for the US to negotiate a diplomatic settlement with Russia. The US, via NATO and its counterparts, encroached all the way up, after decades and decades, all the way up to Russia's borders. Russia has every right to feel threatened by that. That's just the nature of geopolitics. If you have a world superpower aiming nuclear weapons at your border, it's a problem. Ukraine has become a vassal for US power. And the United States does not care about the Ukrainian people, believe it or not. All they care about is American business. That's why we have Secretary of State Antony Blinken admitting that the United States did not listen to Russian security concerns as late as January of 2022 when the war broke out. We have him and other US officials admitting that they will fight to the last Ukrainian. They do not care about the Ukrainians. They will fight to the last one. It doesn't matter. America's going to come out looking great from this. Ukraine will be decimated. We are offering up Ukraine to the Russians on a silver platter, and Ukraine will be destroyed. And that is what people like Vaush are saying. That's what they're calling for. Think about who this benefits. American corporations love that Ukraine is getting destroyed right now, because now American capital can come move in. The IMF can come in now and offer structural adjustment programs to the Ukrainian government, basically putting them in debt to the IMF and Western capital in order to build up their country again. And guess who's going to profit from all this? American corporations. We've already seen this with BlackRock. Already, Larry Fink is meeting with Zelensky. They're getting this all set up. Ukraine will become, if it isn't already now, a plantation for American corporations and American capital accumulation.
Nixon ordered Cambodian genocide. Clinton sent cruise missiles to Sudan, people died. Obama gave the orders to do drone strikes. Reagan invaded Nicaragua in '85.